Well, thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here today for a lot of reasons, but I'll start off by noting I was especially pleased in terms of the room I had here at the AT&T Center because I could kind of just see the top of Memorial Stadium. And you'll say, well, what does that have to do with anything? As you'll see, my presentation, I have a strong historical orientation. And so that historical orientation dates to 1954. And today we'd call it pay to play, pay to show up game in terms of football. But my alma mater, Washington State, played the University of Texas. And before, as the season progressed and they were making arrangements to come down to Austin, they had some communication and they said, we note that you have an African-American player in your team and the hotel that you're scheduled to be housed in is whites only. And we kind of have an unwritten rule here in Texas at Memorial Stadium. We don't have African-Americans play in it. So the player at Washington State was a fellow by the name of Duke Washington, actually Carl Talmadge Washington. And I had seen him play in high school. I'll have to say I didn't play against him. It would have been disastrous. But when presented with this, he said, well, I'm a co-captain of the team. I want to go down there and play. So they made arrangements for him to be housed in a private home, and he showed up for the game, and he had one hell of a game. Unfortunately, Washington State lost, I think it's 40-17, but he had, I think, a 80-yard touchdown run, and in general, the attendees were extraordinarily pleased with Duke Washington's performance. So now you know who was the first African-American football player to play in Memorial Stadium and the team he played for. So that's been a trivia question, and when I asked that of locals, they always say, well, let's see, it was Earl Campbell. I said, no, and they go through some others, but you know the story, and now you see how the world has changed in some arenas. Well, let's get started here. I got some declarations of interest here. As some of you know, I believe in conflicts of interest. I've got all kinds of them. And some people think I have even more than what I may profess. And every one of you in the audience has some. But conflicts of interest are in the eye of the beholder. So here you see some of my declarations, and starting out sort of at the beginning with a Scottish grandmother on one side who worked as a charwoman and believed in hard work, and a Swedish grandmother on the other side, and she also believed in hard work and everything else in moderation. And nobody's actually paid me for any of my work on this round of the ozone. I've written it on my cuff, so to speak. A central theme of my presentation here is that policy and regulations should be informed by the science. Science alone is not sufficient to establish what the specific standard should be. That's a policy judgment. And this is very much misunderstood. Scientists, I came into science at a time period when I viewed science as an issue-resolving activity, problem-solving activity. We could collect scientific information and it would impact on those policy judgments. Today, unfortunately, most of the science we have is what I call science perpetuating activities. We want to make certain that it's going to be perpetuated through at least the end of our career and our postdoc and our graduate students. Now, I've had some interesting debates with some of my colleagues on that, and the younger ones say, Roger, you can afford to be so direct and honest. You got to be in your late 70s. You don't have to raise money to run a laboratory anymore. I said, thank God. So, and then they usually agree with me. Then the issue is the public's caught in the middle. The interesting thing is the public, that amorphous group of individuals, they are really challenged on this. And what I find is, quite frankly, sometimes those who are the least educated formally have the most common sense about them. And very frequently when I talk to a guy doing some handiwork in my home, when we start talking about these things, inevitably they put their hand in their pocket and then they come out and they, you know, is there some of this involved, Doc? And they get the message. So the challenge, I think, is trying to keep these interests separate. And science, just to remind us all, is a broad body of knowledge that's been accumulated by, quote, humankind. I previously had a politically incorrect version. I had man instead of human there. And when my wife went over this, she said, you've got a typo on this. This is the most recent version there. So then we come down to those policy choices, decisions required or allowed by statute that are made using judgment, informed by the science and other considerations. And I'm going to go over that over and over, and I'm going to give you the punchline several times. The administrator, in my opinion, and I'm not a lawyer, has great latitude as to the policy choices and judgments that they can make. Great latitude, including reaffirming a particular standard. Here, you know, we see one of many pieces that have been pulled out talking about this issue of risk and risk aversion, and particularly in, I'd say, the U.S. and other advanced economic societies. You know, if the ruling elite are basically those who are economically well off, you can say, well, we can afford to be risk averse. You know, if you're lower down on the economic ladder, being very blunt, it's a lot tougher to think about that issue. You want some other considerations. So I have great respect for Don Kennedy. I had the pleasure of serving on the original research committee at the Health Effects Institute when he was a member of the board. Here we see that sort of illustrated. Life's risky. I mean, it's really risky out there. Possibility of death. In fact, the probability of death is 1. You know, it's just a question of when it occurs and from what. So the Clean Air Act is multifaceted. We've had a lot of discussion of that already here. I would submit that most people serving on CASAC are clueless as to the content of the Clean Air Act. They focus on Section 108, Section 109, and they just don't understand all the tools. So, you know, if you're like the old carpenter and you got a hammer and a saw, damn it, that's what you're going to use, a hammer and a saw. So they're on CASAC and they're going to save the world in terms of clean air, and the NAAQS are the tool. The NAAQS are the tool. Very, very flawed view of the Clean Air Act. And I think, unfortunately, has impaired the ability of CASAC to offer scientific opinions and judgments. And as we've already heard, no one can take exception to the Clean Air Act and its impact. It has been substantial. But what was appropriate in 1970, I would argue, is not necessarily appropriate a half century later. The tools, the approach But I'm also a realist. The Clean Air Act. How would anyone dare to vote for a change in the Clean Air Act? You must be a Luddite. You must be, how can you do that? I'm not optimistic that we'll even see amendments on it. The 1990 amendments, in my view, is somewhat different than related earlier here. I viewed them as primarily dealing with the air toxics and the intractable problem faced there. And so it was a Band-Aid on air toxics, Newport source performance standards, but it really didn't have much to do with in my opinion, the NAAQS. So setting the standards again, go back to our old paradigm, standard paradigm, hazard and risk. There's no question in terms of looking at the, quote, the criteria air pollutants as to, quote, at some exposure levels, they certainly pose a health hazard. The real scientific question is, what are the effects or absent effects at low levels of exposure? So the policy issue really is, how low is low enough? In the legislative language, we've already seen reference to it. Quite frankly, is very, in my opinion, very loose guidance, and thus has given the courts substantial latitude in interpreting that. Now here we just see the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and I'll just comment, make 2 points here. One is that one of the original criteria air pollutants is missing. It's not shown here. You know what that is? Hydrocarbons, you're right. It was deemed that hydrocarbons did not pose a substantial hazard, and the extent they did, they were adequately covered under the air toxics provisions in the Clean Air Act. So that was removed, and then the NRDC, under the leadership of a young attorney by the name of David Schoenbrod, brought suit to have lead listed. EPA, I think, in my opinion, one of those situations where there were some generous grants from EPA to NRDC, and they said, no, don't throw us into the briar patch. We don't need it. We're going to take care of that in terms of the lead phase down program. But it wouldn't hurt to have the courts tell us we have to do it. So lead was listed, and I note that for several reasons, one of which, that was really my perhaps first introduction to the rigorous political battles of the criteria air pollutants. And the CASE Act did not exist, and so I was kind of pushed in a corner at a meeting of the Science Advisory Board by Norton Nelson from NYU and Sheldon Friedlander from Caltech, UCLA. And they said, Jay, this isn't really health, it's not really engineering, it's kind of all of these. You're the guy who has to chair the ad hoc committee. So I got to chair the committee, and David Schoenbrod sat down in the front row and stared at me through the whole proceeding over 2 years. I had Sam Epstein, who was Dr. Cancer, Dr. Union, who had called me before and said we had 2 lackeys of industry on the committee. They were perhaps the best qualified individuals. Julius Chisholm, a pediatrician from Baltimore, and Paul Hammond, a veterinarian, who I knew well from Cincinnati. But in Sam's view, they were lackeys of industry. And after I told him, I refer you to the administrator, he appointed them, I didn't. If you have a problem, give him a call. Then he said, well, I've got another problem. I said, what's that? He says, it's you as chair. And I said, kind of like the Prime Minister's hour, I refer you to the answer to the previous question. Call Mr. Costel, he appointed me. So that was an interesting one. Let me just jump forward from that very liberal position in the front row on the staff of the NRDC. David Schoenbrod went on and went through substantial evolutionary change and became a libertarian. And I commend to all of you an early writing of his, a book, something like the Clean Air Act, Congress abdicates responsibility and gives the EPA unbridled authority. That's probably a good summary statement in terms of the Clean Air Act. The other point I wanted to make here is that, as a surprise to many who serve on CASAC, there's actually more to the standard than just the indicator and a level. Surprise. You actually have to talk about a statistical form and an averaging time. And we've already fallen into that difficulty here this morning, talking about concentrations. Concentrations with regard to ozone are meaningless unless you talk about the averaging time. And then, if you want to talk about stringency of the standard, you have to talk about the statistical form. So, over the years, there have been 10 chair of CASAC. I was the fourth. I served in terms of 1988 and 92. And the first was Sheldon Friedlander, setting aside the fact that I chaired an ad hoc committee, and Jim Wittenberger from Harvard chaired an ad hoc committee that reviewed the first ozone standard. And over the years, I would say that many on CASAC have not grasped that very important point I've given you. In fact, I can say this because a good friend of mine, Phil Hopke, when he chaired the committee, after they'd agreed on the level, said, well, now that we've got that taken care of, let's talk about the statistical form. He didn't understand the relationship on it. But Phil, by and large, soldiered on. And, but that was a time period, then a sea change, because some within EPA staff, as staff had turned over, became quite concerned about the closure letters that gave CASAC, quote, unbridled authority. They could stop the review process by not giving a closure letter. I would say what has resulted has been much, much worse under the chairmanship of Rogine Henderson, John Samet, and Christopher Fry, because they moved away from a closure letter to starting to give absolute specific advice. So let's come back to ozone, and here we see the several changes in terms of the ozone standard over time. And I would, looking at that, there are relatively few. I would make 2 points. One, it's really remarkable, despite the fact, what's remarkable is there have been a few kind of big trees in the forest. We knew in 1971, when the National Academy of Sciences reviewed ozone, they provided a thin little document. The EPA used that to set that first standard. That, you know, the forest complexion has not changed. What's changed is the undergrowth, the bushes, and some of the trees have become very, you know, long limbs, whatever. But there have been relatively few changes. One occurred in terms of that time period in the middle, and that was when I was chair of CASAC, 88 to 92. And we started to have new evidence from controlled exposures to ozone in terms of clinical studies. And the committee was divided in terms of about half, and let me say, probably somebody who's a real astute follower of CASAC say, well, how can you take 7 and divide that in half? Well, actually, CASAC, the statutory committee, is 7. But EPA has the prerogative of appointing other consultants. So in any given committee, for example, panels that Bob Phelan served on, there may have been 20, 21, 22 individuals, the 7 statutory members plus others. In that case, we had about 16, and they came down half, said, hey, 1 hour averaging time seems to be pretty good. It's loosely related to 8 hours. They kind of, you draw a line there, and the association is pretty tight, or to 24 hours, or to weekly. And I was in that group. My good friend Gil Oman was in that group. The other group was led by Mort Lippmann. They said, oh, we gotta have an 8-hour standard. Well, why? Well, because it's new science, and the studies are compelling. Yeah, they're compelling, but that doesn't dictate that's what the averaging time has to be. The other reason is these agencies out there that are setting up implementation programs, they'll sneak around that. They'll figure out how to meet the 1 hour standard, but not really blunt the ozone. Anyway, we sent a letter to Mr. Riley, Bill Riley, and I got a call from Bill, and he said, Roger, you sure didn't help me out on that. You didn't give me the answer. I said, Bill, that's why they pay you those big bucks as the EPA administrator. You get to decide. We had a group of knowledgeable scientists, and about half of them said this, and about half of them said that. We didn't, there's an old story in terms of the Clean Air Act that Senator Muskie, when it was the early days, was holding hearings. After they closed, he said, God, I wish the hell we could get some one-armed scientists in here. All they want to talk about is on the one hand and on the other hand. Well, we had both-handed scientists. What's amazing to me is in recent years then how you can get 22 independent thinking scientists that come to, quote, consensus views. Well, that's because they treat consensus as what it really is. It's a religious phenomena, a labor phenomena, a political phenomena. Consensus, in my opinion, is not scientific. And I value my ability to give an independent view. And I wish that more on CASAC took that same view. Well, we all know, but need to be reminded periodically that ozone formation, it doesn't come out the tailpipe, it doesn't come out a stack. Although I'm periodically reminded, I had a little ad pop up on my computer yesterday, ozone generator. Yeah, you can get an ozone generator, but that's not what we're facing out there. So it's those VOCs at NOx, sunlight, and then all kinds of conditions have impact in terms of that formation. I'm very pleased that our first speaker this morning talked about biogenics, and they're a wild card in this. They vary markedly across the country. They vary markedly in terms of their natural origin or whether they're coming from specific planted crops. So there are some critical scientific issues, the role of co-pollutants, role of social economic covariance, nature of ambient concentrations, excess risk, and this is the point I want to hit on hard, excess risk. If you were to take a poll of most of the scientific community, of most of the public, they are absolutely convinced that air pollution is a major cause of all manner of maladies, and particularly respiratory disease. Why? Because the scientific community portion has been very good in creating that view. It is not true. And I will challenge anybody to debate me on that. In my opinion, the actual, as I'll note here, we see spatial, geographic variability. We see temporal changes, including other pollutants, other risk factors, and then we get this linear concentration excess risk and large baseline risk. But no one wants to talk about that. George Wolf, when he succeeded me as chair of CASAC, and I worked very closely with him, we insisted that before we come to closure on the ozone criteria document in those days, that they actually identify in the tables the baseline risk. When we testified in the U.S. Senate, they were absolutely flabbergasted at how small the numbers were in excess risk and how big this baseline risk and how variable it was. The late Senator Lincoln Chafee said, "I can't believe it. And you tell me, Dr. McClellan, that's what they want to set the standard on? That's baloney." I said, "I agree." Well, we've already heard reference to the American Trucking Association case. And I think that case, a lot of aspects of it I found as a non-lawyer very interesting. And here you see some of those quotes attributed to Justice Breyer. I just wish that Justice Breyer, who's probably the most knowledgeable jurist we've had in the Supreme Court in terms of risk matters, had been bolder and would have actually dissented, but he didn't. And so some of my lawyer friends over a cocktail tell me, "Roger, this is nice writing. It's kind of eyewash, you know. It's the throwaway opinion on it." So we come down to a central question. Who makes the judgment of acceptable risk in setting the level and form of NAAQS? Now, clearly, in recent years, since Henderson and under Samet and Fry, CASAC thinks they make that determination. They have offered a prescriptive number, level, and then said, and oh, by the way, continue the same form on it. This really started with the PM 2.5. Now, that was an interesting change, again, in terms of review. And as I emphasize, the statute calls for review every 5 years. It never actually happens, but every 5 years. But it doesn't say you have to actually change it. The administrator can reaffirm it. That's what Bill Riley, and quite frankly, he put Administrator Browner in a box. She had no choice when she came in but go ahead and say, we'll go ahead and follow through and reaffirm. But in this case, when Henderson became chair, CASAC, she initially said, we're just going to give the administrator advice. I'm just a plain, simple scientist, grew up in Texas and here in New Mexico. He just wants our advice. But somehow between that statement and the bottom line, they offered this prescriptive statement. Now, on the PM 2.5, unfortunately, I was on the surgical table in Albuquerque getting a hip replacement. So it wasn't until the next week my friend George Wolf called and said, Roger, you won't believe what happened last week at CASAC. And I said, no, almost anything could happen there. Tell me. And he said, well, they said that it ought to be set annual 13 to 14. I said, it's 15. You mean to tell me they're saying the science is so compelling that they know that one integer less would be appropriate? I said, any damn fool knows 14's one integer less than 50, but to suggest that science has to be there, and I guess there are some who must have said, we'd like it at 13, because they wouldn't have had the temerity to say you can't go lower. So that was the battle. And then that was also interesting, because that's when, if you'll examine CASAC letters, they sometimes refer to CASAC and then they'll put statutorily constituted. That means 7 people who were appointed statutorily agreed on something. And in this case, there were 2 dissenters, myself and Wolf, and so ultimately the administrator took our account of our advice and said he wasn't going to go to 15, but they got it later. That really set the stage then for ozone and the recommendation of 60 to 70. The administrator said, I'll take your dare, set it to 75. And in a figurative sense, and I emphasize this, they stamped their feet and screamed. Rogene Henderson, who's a good friend of mine, said, we didn't scream, we didn't stamp our feet, Roger. You shouldn't say that. Well, figuratively, I'm saying they said that. And they weren't happy with the 75, and so they followed up with a letter to the administrator, knowing that would provide the groundwork for Lisa Jackson to go into the reconsideration fiasco, which cost the taxpayers millions of dollars. So I just show this again in terms of a sea change of information. One of it was moving into these big epi studies and on it. And I always find this interesting. You won't be able to see and read off the names of cities. But if I take some of those cities up near the top, and that also includes my hometown, Albuquerque, and Austin, I say, how do I explain to my elected officials, we don't have a problem here in Albuquerque, but when the statisticians roll all this together, because there are 7 cities that appear to have a problem, and we get a national value out of this, you got to do something. And that means you're doing something. Well, we go into the issue of background, disbenefits, and I would call to your attention the comments put into the docket, ozone docket, by the EMA on disbenefits. It's an excellent, well-written piece, commentary, and emphasizes that, you know, the field down at near that background is not a level one. There are going to be some areas where you're actually going to increase risks and probably increase the risks in terms of socioeconomically deprived individuals. Well, getting ready for a meeting several years ago with the California Air Resources Board, I tried to figure out how could I get some perspective on that relative risk of 1.02. Now keep in mind it's 1.02 because it's per 10 ppb. If we actually were just scientifically honest and said per ppm, it'd be 1.002. So I came up with this one, and this is socioeconomic status. And by a friend, Kyle Stenland, who he and I sometimes are in opposite poles. I called him up when I saw this paper, and I said, Kyle, this is fantastic. I think this is the best paper you've ever written. I said, are you following up? He said, oh, Roger, that's the last paper I wrote at CDC. Now I'm over at Emory, and I got to go out and raise bucks to support my research. They don't give you money to do this stuff. Yet it's a very valuable piece. Bottom line is relative risk for men for many social health endpoints up there around 2.00. The bottom quartile socioeconomic status over the top. And women, it's somewhere in there, 1.2 up. One of them's interesting. Being poor protects you against breast cancer. And that always, when I talk to people working with me, say, well, why is that? And I said, because poor women have children earlier, that protects against breast cancer. They have more children, that protects against breast cancer. Nuns are on the short end. It's one of the oldest known occupational hazards, and that's excess. So my advice is some common sense policy judgments by the EPA administrator they should consider, and you can go down through this list. I think, again, the administrator has great latitude in making the policy choices. And I would hope as we go forward that scientists will be somewhat more humility in terms of making scientific advice and leave the policy judgments to the administrator. And thus, that's my wrap up there. And the bottom line is, in my opinion, sound decisions are all about context. Sound decisions are all about context. So CASAC, which is looking from a very small platform through a small porthole into the world, does not have the ability to provide context and thus should refrain from the kind of decisions made. And the administrator, on the other hand, should have certainly the willingness to make common sense judgments. That's different than a political judgment. Political judgment is what is being set up. We'll take comments from here to here, and we'll split the difference, and how about 65 or 70? With that, I'll conclude and welcome the opportunity to speak with you at various points during the meeting and hear your views on the comments I've offered here. Thank you very much.